The summer of 1889 came down on New Mexico like a judgment, not the kind that arrives with thunder or warning, the quiet kind, the kind that settles into the earth and the bones of men slowly over years, until one morning you wake up and realize the weight has been there so long, you stopped noticing it was wrong. Wade Callum noticed everything. That was the thing about a man who had spent 30 years working the same stretch of land outside Red Rock. You learned to read the ground the way other men read faces, the angle of a shadow at a certain hour, the way cattle moved when something upstream had disturbed the water. The difference between a track left by a ranch wagon heading to market and one left by something heavier, lower to the ground, moving at an hour when honest men were asleep. He had found those tracks that morning, ridden out before first light the way he always did, crossing the southeast corner of his property where the fence line dipped toward the dry creek bed. That was where he saw them. Two sets of wheel ruts cutting straight across the dry grass, heading northwest, bearing the kind of deep impression that came from weight unevenly distributed, not grain, not timber, something that shifted. He crouched beside the nearest track and studied it. The compression pattern told him more than the depth. The outside edges of the rut were pressed down harder than the center, which meant the load was braced against the sides rather than stacked flat. You braced loads against the sides when the contents were not cargo you wanted moving freely. When the contents were something that might otherwise shift in ways you couldn't afford. He stood and looked northwest toward the ridgeline and said nothing to the empty morning around him because there was nothing yet to say. But he remembered it. Wade Callum was not a man given to alarm. Alarm cost energy, and energy at 48 was something you spent carefully. He had learned that the hard way through a life that had handed him more than its share of hard things. The ranch, the drought years, the fever that had taken his wife Clara 6 years back, quick and merciless as a grass fire. He had come through all of it the same way, quietly. One morning at a time, without complaint and without expecting the world to adjust itself for his benefit. Clara used to say he went quiet the way other men went to church deliberately and with purpose. She had meant it as a compliment, which was one of the many things he had loved about her. He still thought about that sometimes in the mornings before the work started, in the particular silence of a house that had once held 2 people and now held 1. He finished his ride, came back to the house, ate, drank 2 cups of coffee that were both too hot and too bitter, and sat on the porch steps for a while, watching the sun climb the sky and burn the last of the night's chill out of the air. Then he saddled back up and rode toward the Hail property, not because he was frightened, not because he had any particular suspicion formed yet in his mind, simply because those tracks had crossed his land without permission, and the wagon that made them had come from the direction of Sheriff Harlon Hale's spread. And the decent thing, the honest thing was to ride over and say so to a man's face, rather than let it sit and fester into something worse than it probably was. That was the kind of man Wade Callum was, or tried to be, the kind who dealt with things directly without drama. without letting small things become large through the simple failure of attention. He did not know riding out that morning in the early August heat, with the sky already bleaching white above the mesa, that the small thing he was riding toward was not small at all. He did not know that what waited for him at the Hail property would reach all the way back 20 years into the part of his past he had spent 2 decades trying to make his peace with. He did not know any of it yet. He was just a rancher riding toward a neighbor's fence line on a hot morning in 1889, carrying nothing more complicated than a reasonable question about wagon tracks. The land between his property and Hale's spread was about 3 miles of open country flat and pale and shimmering already in the heat. There was almost no shade. The few scrub junipers that dotted the plain threw shadows too thin to matter. Red Rock sat about 4 miles beyond that, a collection of buildings around a main street that looked more permanent than it had any right to, given how recently it had been built. A courthouse, a bank, a general store that doubled as the post office, a church with a bell tower that had been leaning slightly south since before Wade arrived in the territory, and a sheriff's office with a man inside it that this whole valley had decided to trust. Wade had voted for Harlon Hail himself. Twice. Both times without hesitation, because Hail had seemed to him then what a lawman ought to be. Steady, unhurried. The kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself because it carried its own weight. He had a handshake that meant something, and a reputation for remembering names, which in a small community was not a small thing. That was the man Wade was riding toward, the man he expected to find. What he found was something else. He came around the east side of the property, along the track that ran parallel to Hale's fence line, and pulled his horse up before he fully understood why. Something had registered in the back of his mind before his conscious thought had time to name it. A wrongness in the arrangement of the yard ahead. He sat still in the saddle and looked. The ranch house stood in the middle distance, its whitewashed walls absorbing the morning heat. The outbuildings flanked it on the right. The horse pen was to the left, 3 animals standing together at the far end, in what little shade the fence posts threw. The front door of the house was closed. The rear door was not, and there in the open ground between the house and the first outbuilding, a young woman was on her knees. Wade did not move immediately. His eyes went to her and stayed there with the focused stillness of a man who had learned long ago that the first 5 seconds of seeing something you don't understand are the most important 5 seconds you have, because they are the only seconds during which you are still capable of seeing it clearly, before your mind starts reshaping what's in front of you into something it already knows how to handle. Her wrists were bound behind her. The rope was not loose. She was wearing a pale blouse that had at some point recently been white, and there was a dark stain spreading from just below her left shoulder that was not from the heat or the dust. Her hair was loose and tangled. Her head was down. She was not performing distress. She was simply in it the way a person is when they have been in it long enough that performing it is no longer something they have energy for. Wade dismounted. He tied his horse to the fence post with a knot that could be undone fast if needed, which was a habit he had never let go of since the years when that kind of thinking was part of his daily work. Then he walked toward her. Not fast, not slow. The way you approach something when you don't know yet whether it will run or fight or simply collapse. She heard him coming. Her head came up. She was young, 20-something, with a face that would have been composed and intelligent under other circumstances. Dark eyes that were red at the edges from crying that had stopped some time ago. A cut along her jaw that was old enough to have started bruising, but recent enough that the bruise hadn't fully set. She looked at him with an expression that was equal parts relief and terror, which was a combination Wade had only seen a handful of times in his life and never forgot when he did. He stopped about 6 feet from her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she said it, not loudly, not with the kind of desperate urgency you might expect from a young woman on her knees with her hands tied. Quiet and direct, like someone delivering information they needed another person to have. Leave right now. He'll have me killed, and you too. Wade looked at her for a long moment without responding. The first thing he registered was that she was not telling him to help her. She was telling him to go. And the distinction mattered because a person running a deception doesn't usually open with that. A person trying to draw someone in doesn't push them away. She was afraid, and the fear was not pointed at him. It was pointed past him, behind him, at something further out. The second thing he registered was the rope. He had seen rope used that way before, not on cattle, not in the ordinary work of a ranch. There was a particular technique to the binding around a person's wrists, a way the cord was wound and knotted that minimized struggle while maximizing the sensation of complete helplessness. And it was not something that happened by accident or improvisation. Someone had known what they were doing when they tied those knots. Wade had seen that specific configuration exactly once before in his life, 20 years ago, in a different county, when he had been 28 years old and working as a deputy under a sheriff. He had trusted riding out to investigate a report of a missing woman and finding instead the place where she had been held. The rope still on the floor of the empty building. The woman herself already gone and never found again. He had stood in that empty building for a long time that day, looking at the rope on the floor, trying to understand how he had missed it, how the signs he had seen over the preceding weeks had not added up to what they should have added up to. How he had looked directly at the truth and read it as something smaller. He had left that job 6 months later, left that county, come to New Mexico and built something quiet and useful and honest with his hands and his land and the years he had left. He had not thought about that rope in a very long time. He was thinking about it now. "What's your name?" he said. She hesitated. Then Norah Hail. The name landed with the particular weight of a thing that reorders everything around it. Wade kept his expression exactly as it was. Hail, the sheriff's daughter. He looked at the house again, at the rear door hanging open, at the quality of silence coming from inside, the kind of silence that meant either emptiness or someone waiting very still. "Your father do this?" She looked at him for a long time without answering. And then something shifted in her face, something that had been held rigid by sheer endurance, and it came apart just slightly at the edges. "He said I'd been asking questions I had no business asking," she said. "He said he needed me to understand the difference between knowing something and being able to do anything about it." Wade crouched down so he was level with her. "What did you ask him about?" "A room," she said. "A room in the storage building he keeps locked from the outside. I asked him what was in it." She stopped. "Then I saw through the door slats 2 nights ago. There was a girl inside. She couldn't have been more than 16, sitting on the floor, not crying, not doing anything, just sitting there with her eyes already somewhere else." The heat pressed down on both of them. A horse stamped somewhere in the pen, somewhere on the ridge behind the property. A bird called once, and then was silent. Wade had been a man who dealt in facts for 48 years. Not emotions, not suspicions, facts and their consequences. He looked at Norah Hail, kneeling in the dirt of her father's yard, and he assembled the facts in front of him with the same methodical care he gave to everything. The tracks on his land, the rope around her wrists, the rear door hanging open, the bruise on her jaw, the stain on her blouse, the girl in the locked room, the sheriff of Red Rock County standing somewhere behind all of it. He had assembled facts like that before, 20 years ago, and he had looked at them and found a reason to set them aside, to read them as something smaller to write away. He had told himself for 20 years that he hadn't known, that there wasn't enough to act on, that a young deputy didn't challenge the man above him without something solid. He had told himself a lot of things. Standing in that empty building with the rope on the floor, he had known, not suspected, known, and he had made his choice. The woman who had been held in that building had never been found. He was not going to make that choice again. Wade reached into his coat pocket for his folding knife. "Can you stand?" he said. "If you help me." He moved behind her and cut the rope. The fibers parted, and she pulled her arms forward slowly, the way you do when you've been in one position long enough that movement itself becomes something that has to be relearned. She was shaking, but she didn't make a sound about it. He took her by the arm and helped her to her feet, and she stood unsteady, blinking in the white morning light. Then she remembered something. Or rather, she reached for something she had been holding on to through everything that had happened. A decision made before Wade had arrived that she had not yet had the opportunity to act on. "Wait," she said. She looked toward the house, at the rear door still hanging open. "His office," she said. "Before he came out this morning, I had a few minutes alone in there." She looked at Wade. "There are papers. I know where he keeps them." Wade looked at the open door, then at the ridge, then back at Norah. "How long?" he said. 2 minutes. Less." He weighed it. The ridge was still empty. The sound of hooves he had been half listening for had not materialized. 2 minutes was 2 minutes. "Go," he said. "I'll watch the road." She went. He stood at the edge of the yard with his back to the house and his eyes on the northwest ridge, and he counted the seconds the way a man counts when the number matters. And at 91 seconds, she came back through the rear door, moving fast with something folded and pressed against her body inside her blouse. "Got them," she said. "Then we move now." He started toward the fence line along the side of the property. She came with him, each step deliberate, her jaw set against whatever her body was telling her. They moved low and quiet along the edge of the outbuilding, keeping out of the sightline from the road. Wade paused, once hand out listening. Dust settling. The distant sound of nothing yet. They slipped through a gap in the fence where one of the posts had rotted and leaned, and then they were off Hale's property and into the open scrubland beyond, moving toward the dry gulch that ran behind the neighboring properties like an old scar in the earth. Wade kept his eyes on the ridge to the northwest. The same ridge where, if a man were returning from that direction, he would first appear as a shape against the sky. The ridge was empty. For now. They dropped down into the gulch, and the temperature fell 5 degrees in the shade of the earthen walls, which wasn't enough to make it comfortable, but was enough to make it bearable. Norah leaned back against the dirt wall and closed her eyes for a moment. Wade passed her his canteen. She drank without speaking 2 long pulls and handed it back. Then she told him the rest of it, not all at once, in the way things come out when someone has been holding them too long and the pressure has finally exceeded what the body can contain. In pieces, with silences between the pieces that were as important as the words themselves. The wagons had been coming through for at least 8 months, maybe longer. Always at night, always from the south, cutting across the back roads that ran through the territory between Red Rock and the border. Always carrying women, young women, most of them, some barely old enough to be called that. None of them speaking English. all of them frightened in the way of people who have already used up their capacity for outward fear and are now simply enduring. Norah had noticed the first time 3 months ago. A sound in the night, low and constant, the kind that doesn't fit the ordinary nighttime vocabulary of a ranch. She had gone to the window and seen the wagon in the yard, and her father standing beside it in the dark, talking to men she didn't recognize. And the way he stood told her everything she needed to know about whether this was legitimate. He stood the way men stand when they're engaged in something they believe no one can touch them for. Relaxed, proprietary, certain. She had gone back to bed. She had told herself a story about what she had seen. Several stories. Each one smaller than the last. Each one more comfortable. Each one a little further from the truth she had actually observed with her own eyes from her own window. She was not stupid. She had always known that. What she had been was afraid, which is a different thing entirely, and which she was less willing to excuse in herself now than she had been 3 months ago. 2 nights ago, she had gotten up in the dark and gone to the storage building because she had heard a sound from inside it that she could not make herself explain away. A sound that belonged to a human being. She had gone to the door and looked through the gap in the slats. The girl had been sitting on the bare floor with her knees pulled up to her chest, her head leaning against the wall behind her, her eyes open and looking at nothing. Young, too young. The hollowed-out stillness of someone who has already traveled some internal distance from which return is not guaranteed. Norah had stood at that door for a long time. Then she had gone to her father. She told it flatly without self-pity, as though reporting on something that had happened to someone else. She had gone to her father and told him what she had seen and asked him directly what it meant. And her father had looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Something that lived between disappointment and cold calculation. And he had told her quietly and without raising his voice that she needed to be very careful about what she thought she knew. Then he had called for Silas Vane. She didn't say what happened after that. She didn't have to. The bruise on her jaw and the rope on her wrists were sufficient account. But then she reached inside her blouse and produced what she had taken from her father's office. Several pages torn from what appeared to be a ledger folded together, and slightly damp from being pressed against her skin. She held them out to Wade. He took them and unfolded them carefully. Columns of dates and numbers and names written in a careful hand accustomed to keeping accounts. He scanned down the names. Some meant nothing to him. Some meant a great deal. Judge Orville Mast, Red Rock County Circuit Court. Emmett Drury, First Territorial Bank, Red Rock. Reverend Francis Lowe, First Methodist Church of Red Rock. And at the top of each column initialed in the same careful hand, H. Harlon Hail. Wade read the pages twice. Then he folded them carefully and held them and looked at the middle distance for a long moment. He thought about Norah's description of her father. He thought about a memory she had mentioned almost in passing while they were moving through the scrubland. She had said it quietly, more to herself than to him, the way people say things they have been turning over for a long time. She had said, "I keep thinking about when I was young, when he pinned his badge on for the first time in front of me. He said the badge meant you carried people's trust, that it was heavier than iron." I believed him. For a very long time, I believed him completely. Wade had said nothing then. He said nothing now. But he heard it, the way you hear something that lands in a place you recognize because you have been in that place yourself. The specific grief of a person who has discovered that the thing they built their understanding of the world upon was not what they thought it was. He had known men like Harlon Hail. He had worked for a man like that once in another county, in another decade. And he had learned the hard way that the ones who were best at appearing to be the foundation were sometimes the ones most invested in making sure you never looked at what was underneath. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, where he had put a folded slip of paper he had found near the wagon tracks that morning. He had picked it up without thinking, tucked it away out of habit, and then half forgotten it in the business of everything that followed. He unfolded it now, a small piece of paper torn at one edge with writing in a hurried hand. Not a full message, a notation, a place name, a time, a date. Red River Crossing, 9 o'clock, and below that, the date. Today? He held it out to Norah. She looked at it. The color went out of her face the way heat leaves stone after sundown quickly and completely. "That's tonight," she said, very quietly. "That's where they take them next." She looked up at him. "If we're right about what this is, there are girls out there right now waiting for those wagons." Wade folded the paper and put it back in his coat. He looked up toward the top of the gulch where the pale sky sat above the earthen walls like a lid. From somewhere above, distorted by the terrain, came the sound that had been building at the edge of his awareness for the last several minutes. Hooves, multiple horses, moving at a deliberate pace, not galloping, not rushing, the measured, methodical pace of men who were not chasing blindly, but reading the ground. They were looking, and one of them knew exactly what to look for. Wade stood and looked at Norah Hail, who was 24 years old and injured and exhausted, and about as far from helpless as a person in her condition had any right to be. She was looking back at him with the steadiness of someone who has already burned through their fear and come out the other side into something harder and more durable. He thought about the note in his pocket. He thought about the tracks on his land. He thought about a building in another county 20 years ago, and a rope on a floor, and a woman who was never found. He had stood in that empty building for a long time. He had made his choice. He had spent 20 years living inside that choice. He was not going to make it again. "Can you ride?" he said. "Yes." "Then we move, and we don't stop until we figure out who else in this county is still worth trusting." They came up out of the gulch at the far end, where the earthen wall dropped low enough to climb, and they moved fast and low across the open scrubland toward where Wade had tied his horse. And behind them, the sound of hoofbeats on the ridge grew neither closer nor further away, which was the most unsettling thing of all, because it meant whoever was up there was very good at what they were doing, and they had not stopped looking. The gulch ran west for about a mile before it opened into a shallow basin ringed by low scrub and broken sandstone, and that was where Wade brought them. Not because it was safe. Nothing out here was safe anymore, and he was honest enough with himself to stop pretending otherwise. But the basin offered something the open country didn't. 3 ways out, high ground on the north side for visibility, and a stand of juniper dense enough along the eastern wall that 2 people and a horse could disappear into it if they stayed still and stayed quiet. He tied his horse deep in the junipers and helped Norah sit with her back against the largest trunk. The shade was thin, but it was shade. He gave her the canteen again, and this time she drank slowly, deliberately, the way you do when you've stopped running on adrenaline and your body starts sending honest reports about its condition. She had a bad bruise developing along her left collarbone, visible now, where the collar of her blouse had torn. Her wrists were raw from the rope. The cut on her jaw had stopped bleeding, but it needed cleaning. Wade tore a strip from the lining of his coat without ceremony and handed it to her. She pressed it against the cut without comment. They sat for a while in the particular silence of 2 people who have just run from something and have not yet figured out where they are running to. Wade was thinking. He did his best thinking, and silence always had. He was arranging what he knew into its proper shape. The wagon tracks, the note, the girl in the locked room, the systematic movement of women through the back roads of Red Rock County at night, the sheriff of that county standing in his yard in the dark beside a wagon, relaxed and proprietary and certain, the way Norah had been bound. The ledger pages with their careful columns of names and numbers. He thought about the kind of man Harlon Hail appeared to be. The steady handshake, the reputation, the way the whole valley had organized itself around his authority, the way settlements organize themselves around water, as though the thing at the center is simply a fact of the landscape and not a choice made by men. He had known men like that before, and he had learned the hard way that the ones who were best at appearing to be the foundation were sometimes the ones most invested in making sure you never looked at what was underneath it. "Tell me the rest," he said. Norah looked at him. "You told me what you saw and what you asked your father. But you're not surprised by any of this, which means some part of you has known about this for longer than 2 nights ago." A pause. Then, 8 months, she said finally. "Maybe 9. I noticed the first wagon in November. I told myself it was legitimate freight." She paused. "I kept telling myself that, even when the evidence stopped supporting it, even when I started hearing things, names mentioned and then never mentioned again. Conversations that went quiet when I walked into a room. She stopped. I wanted it to be something smaller than what it was. I know, Wade said. Something in the way he said it made her look at him carefully. He didn't elaborate. Not yet. He had not spoken out loud about what happened 20 years ago to anyone. Not to Clara. Not to the men he'd worked alongside in the years after. It had lived inside him in the space that grief usually occupies, which was appropriate because it was a kind of grief, the particular grief of a man who knows exactly when he made the wrong choice and has to live in every day that came after it. The room, he said instead. The locked room. You saw one girl. Were there others? I don't know for certain. The storage building has 3 separate sections. I only saw into one. Who else on the property knew? The 2 men my father keeps permanently, Dix and Harrow. They've been with him since before I came back from school. They don't ask questions. I think that's specifically why he keeps them. Anyone else? She hesitated. In that hesitation, Wade read something. Not deception, the reluctance that comes before saying something out loud that you have been carrying silently, because saying it out loud makes it irreversible. Colt Briggs, she said. Wade looked at her. My father's deputy. I think he knows. Maybe not everything, but enough. She paused. He looked at me once about 3 months ago in the street outside the general store. Just for a moment. The way someone looks at you when they know something about your life that you don't know, they know. And then he looked away and never looked at me like that again. Like he'd decided something. Wade filed that away. Deputy Colt Briggs. Mid-30s if he remembered right. Quiet man. Kept himself contained in the way men do when they are either naturally reserved or actively managing what they let show. He had not formed a strong impression of him either way, which now struck him as notable. He heard it then, not the sound of pursuit. Something different. A single horse moving at a careful pace along the top of the gulch to the north. Moving like someone who already knew where they were going. Wade was on his feet before the thought was fully formed. He moved Norah deeper into the junipers with one hand and positioned himself at the edge of the tree line with his back to the largest trunk. He did not draw his weapon. Drawing before you understood what you were drawing against was how situations escalated past the point of retrieval. The horse stopped. Silence. Then a voice came down from the edge of the gulch above them. Not shouted, controlled and deliberate with the quality of someone very carefully managing what their voice was communicating. Callum! Wade didn't move. I know you're in there, both of you. A pause. I tracked you from the fence line. I'm alone. Wade stepped out from the tree line into the open. Deputy Colt Briggs sat on his horse at the top of the gulch wall looking down. He was younger than Wade, mid-30s, with a lean face that had been weathered past its years and pale eyes doing complicated work behind their surface calm. He wore his badge. He was not pointing anything at anyone. He had also not signaled for backup or announced his location as far as Wade could tell. Which was the most significant thing about the tableau, and both men understood it. The silence between them stretched out long enough to mean something. Then Briggs said, "You picked the worst possible day to involve yourself in this, Callum." "Maybe," Wade said, "or maybe it's the only day that mattered." Briggs didn't answer that. He looked past Wade toward the junipers where Norah was. His jaw moved once. Then he dismounted and came down into the gulch, carefully watching his footing on the loose earth. When he reached the bottom, he stood about 10 feet from Wade and put his hands at his sides where they were visible. They looked at each other. "How long?" Wade said. Briggs took a breath. 8 months. The number landed in the air between them and stayed there. 8 months, Wade repeated. "Yes? And in 8 months you didn't—" "No. Flat. Final. Not defensive, which was almost worse than defensive." "I didn't." The silence that followed was a specific kind. The kind that forms around a thing that has been said out loud for the first time and is now taking up permanent space in the room. Norah came out of the junipers. She stood looking at Briggs with an expression that was entirely empty of the things you might expect. No surprise, no appeal, just the level assessment of someone who is past the point of expecting better from anyone. Briggs looked at her. He did not look away. "Miss Hale." His voice was careful. "I am sorry, for what it's worth." "It's worth less than you think," she said. He didn't argue. "Why?" Wade said. "I need to understand why." Briggs was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ground, then back up. When he spoke, there was nothing in his voice designed to make this easier on himself. "Your father," he said to Norah, "found out about something I did 3 years ago, before I was a deputy. A payment I took to look the other way on something, not this. Something smaller, but enough." He paused. "He kept documentation, told me if I moved against him, if I wrote anything down, if I spoke to anyone, he'd have it delivered to my wife, along with a full account of everything he'd observed about my conduct since." He stopped. "I have 2 daughters, 7 and 9 years old." The heat pressed down into the gulch. "So you stayed quiet," Wade said. "I stayed quiet." "For 8 months." "Yes." Wade looked at him for a long time. He was not performing judgment. He was genuinely trying to understand, because understanding mattered. The man in front of him was either an asset or a liability for what was coming tonight, and Wade needed to know which one. He thought about his own silence, his own 20 years, the various shapes that fear took, and the various justifications it built around itself, and how from the inside, every single one of them felt like reason and not like cowardice. He thought about a rope on a floor in an empty building. He thought, I have no right to judge this man. And then he thought, but I am going to need him tonight, whether he deserves my trust or not. The note, Wade said. He produced the folded slip from his coat. Red River Crossing, tonight. Briggs looked at it. Something in his face went very still. Where did you find that? Near the wagon tracks on my land this morning. Came off one of the wagons. Yes, Briggs said quietly. It would have. He looked up. Tonight is the last run on this route. Hale's been moving the operation. Different territory, different roads. Tonight is when they move everyone they've been holding through to the next stage. He paused. After tonight, there's nothing left here to find. Nothing that can't be explained away. Norah made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound that came from somewhere beneath words. How many? Wade said. At least 6 women, maybe more. I don't have a precise count. A pause. The girl in the storage room has been there 5 days. Then we're going tonight, Wade said. Briggs looked at him steadily, then at the ledger pages. How much of the account is in there? Enough, Norah said. Massed, Drury, low, the amounts, the dates. 11 separate entries going back to November. Something moved through Briggs's expression. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. He's going to be there tonight. Hail. He always oversees the final run personally. Good, Wade said. A pause. Briggs studied him. You understand what you're saying. I understand exactly what I'm saying. I can't guarantee you anything on the other side of this. The machinery Hale built didn't get built in 8 months. Mast controls the bench. Drury controls the money. Even with that ledger, the people who need to answer for this won't all answer tonight. Maybe not this year. No, Wade said. They won't. So what's the plan? Wade thought about Red River Crossing, which he knew. Had been there twice. A wide, flat area where the river ran shallow over bedrock and the old crossing road came through from the south. A warehouse on the north bank, large enough to hold wagons. Multiple approaches. Not a complete plan yet, but the shape of one. You know the crossing, he said to Briggs. Well enough. Then we ride at sundown. Wade paused. But not all together, not by the same road. Briggs looked at him. I need you to do something first, Wade said, before you ride to the crossing. What? Ride to Red Rock. There are people in that town who have lived their whole lives in Harlon Hale's county, who have trusted him, who deserve to know what's been done in their name. He held Briggs's gaze. Bring them to Red River Crossing. Not as a mob, as witnesses. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Briggs understood what Wade was asking. He understood it completely. Bringing witnesses to the crossing meant everything that happened there would be public and irrevocable. No quiet arrangements afterward. No convenient narrative about a rancher and a disturbed young woman who attacked a legitimate freight operation. The story would be told by too many mouths to be rewritten. It also meant Briggs himself would be among those witnesses, would be the man who had brought them, would have to stand in front of the people of Red Rock County and be the deputy who had known for 8 months and said nothing, standing there now at the 11th hour, because something had finally outweighed his fear. That accounting would come. Briggs knew it. Wade could see him knowing it. "I have 2 daughters," Briggs said, one more time. But the weight of it was different now. Less like a reason to stay silent, and more like the specific thing that made the silence finally impossible to maintain. "I know," Wade said. "That's exactly why." Briggs looked at him for a long moment. Then he gave one short nod. Not enthusiastic. Not the nod of a man who had found his heroism. The nod of a man who has run out of options that let him keep what he's been protecting and has chosen accordingly. That was enough. "You ride to Red Rock," Wade said. "Norah and I ride to the crossing. We come at it from the south, from the approach along the river. We hold until you arrive with whoever you bring. Then we move. And if Hail has more men than we expect, then we deal with that when we get there." Briggs stood. He looked at Norah one more time. She was looking back at him with the same level expression she had maintained throughout. No forgiveness in it. No invitation. Just the honest assessment of a young woman who had learned in the last 24 hours to take people exactly as they were, and not as she needed them to be. He mounted his horse without another word and rode north toward Red Rock at a pace that meant business. Wade watched him go. Then he looked west, where the sun had dropped to the height of the mesa, and the light had changed from white to the long amber of late afternoon, making everything in the New Mexico landscape look permanent and ancient and indifferent to human time. He looked at Norah. She was watching the direction Briggs had gone, her expression unreadable. "Do you trust him?" she said. Not really asking, working something out. "Not completely," Wade said, "but enough for tonight." She nodded slowly. That seemed right to her. That seemed like the honest answer. They sat in the thinning shade of the junipers and waited for the sun to finish its work. And Wade spent those hours going over the variables with the methodical attention of a man who knows that care taken in the quiet before a thing is the difference between coming back and not. He thought about the approaches to Red River Crossing, the sight lines, the number of men Hail typically ran, the layout of the warehouse as he remembered it from 2 brief visits years ago. He thought about Norah. She would stay at the tree line with his horse. He had decided that, and he would tell her that, and she would agree, and then she would do whatever she was going to do because she was Harlon Hale's daughter, and Harlon Hale had not raised a person who stayed at the tree line when something needed doing. He was not under any real illusion about that. But he would tell her anyway, because the telling mattered even when the outcome was uncertain. He thought about the women in the locked room, the girl who had been there 5 days. He thought about the rope on the floor of the empty building 20 years ago, and the choice he had made, and the 20 years he had spent inside that choice. He was not going to spend 20 more. The sun touched the rim of the mesa, and the amber light began its shift towards something darker and more final. And Wade Callum stood up and put his hat on and looked at the young woman sitting against the juniper trunk, with her father's ledger pages pressed against her ribs and a strip of coat lining held against her jaw. "We ride now," he said. "You stay at the tree line until the door is open. That is not a negotiation." She looked up at him. "Understood," she said, which was not the same as agreeing, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so out loud. They mounted up as the last of the daylight bled out of the sky, and they rode south and west toward Red River Crossing, with the stars beginning to show above them one at a time, and the warm New Mexico night settled around them like something that had been waiting a long time for this particular evening to arrive. The sun dropped behind the mesa at 7:43. Wade knew the time not because he carried a watch, but because he had spent 30 years reading the sky over this particular stretch of New Mexico, and the way the light died in the west told him what he needed to know with an accuracy no instrument could improve upon. He and Norah had been riding for nearly 2 hours when Red River Crossing appeared in the darkness ahead, and Wade raised his fist, and they stopped behind a low stand of brush on the rise above the riverbank. He studied what was in front of him. The warehouse occupied the flattest ground on the north bank, a long, low building of timber and corrugated iron that had been built for legitimate freight and had found a second purpose somewhere in the last several years. 2 wagons were staged along the south wall canvas covers, pale in the starlight, horses already harnessed and facing out. Everything ready to move the moment the word was given. Men who did this kind of work did not leave wagons unready on a final run night. 2 guards outside, one at the front corner of the building, one near the wagons. Light from inside thin yellow lines through the gaps in the wall boards. Voices too low to carry words, but present. Wade studied the approach for a long 2 minutes. Then he leaned toward Norah and spoke barely above a whisper, outlining what he saw, confirming the plan. She listened without interrupting. "Tree line," he said when he finished, "with my horse, until the door is open." She held his gaze in the dark for a moment. "Go," she said. "I'll be where I need to be." He understood that for exactly what it was. He turned his horse and moved. He came at the warehouse from the south, using the shadow of the building itself as cover for the last 100 yards, moving low and deliberate in the way that paradoxically attracts less attention than rushing, because rushing creates sound, and sound creates attention, and attention. Tonight was the thing most likely to get someone killed. The guard near the wagons was standing with his back partly turned, looking north toward the river. He was carrying a rifle at a relaxed angle, the posture of a man who expected his shift to be uneventful. Wade covered the last 20 feet in a straight line and was on him before the man had fully registered the change in the air around him. No weapon, no noise. Wade caught him by the shoulder and the back of the collar and drove him into the side of the wagon with concentrated force, controlled and deliberate. and the man went down and stayed down without making a sound worth mentioning. Wade moved to the corner of the building. The second guard was at the front facing the road. Wade watched him for 10 seconds, timing his movement. The man shifted his weight, turned his head to look south, and in that quarter turn, Wade crossed the gap and repeated the process. Efficient. The way you learned to do things after enough years of understanding that violence in service of something necessary was still most useful when it was as contained as the situation allowed. He flattened against the wall beside the side entrance. He tested the door. Not locked. He eased it open 6 inches and looked through the gap. The interior was lit by 3 lanterns hung from the ceiling beams, throwing warm, unsteady light across a space larger than it appeared from outside. Stacked crates along the north wall. 2 men Wade didn't recognize sitting on those crates playing cards. A third man standing near the far end with his back to the door talking to someone Wade couldn't see around the angle. And to the left of the entrance set into the interior wall, a heavy door. Locked from the outside with a bar latch and a padlock. From behind it came no sound, which told him the people inside had learned to be very quiet, and he knew with cold certainty which version of that was true. He went through the door, fast and low, without announcing himself. He covered the distance to the nearest man before the playing cards hit the floor. He put that man down cleanly and turned to the second in the same motion, and the second man had half risen from his seat and was reaching for his hip when Wade closed the distance and removed that option from consideration. With a grip that came from 30 years of working cattle and fencing, and the physical vocabulary of a life lived close to hard labor. The third man at the far end spun around, one of Hale's permanent hands. Dick's or Harrow, he had never known which was which. The man's eyes went wide and then narrow in the space of a second, and he went for his weapon. A sound behind Wade, the side door opening. He registered it as Norah a half-second before he heard her footsteps, which was too late to do anything about it, and too late to matter, because what happened next happened fast. The man across the room had his gun clear of the holster, tracking toward Wade, and Wade was moving left behind a crate when Norah crossed the room to the interior wall, and her hands found the ring of keys on a peg beside the stacked crates. She had it off the wall and was at the padlocked door before the man with the gun had fully reacquired his target. The keys rattled once. The lock gave. The man adjusted his aim toward movement. From outside came a sharp crack. Not a gunshot. The sound of a hitch post giving way under controlled force followed immediately by the complaint of horses being cut loose. Briggs doing what he was supposed to do, having arrived from Red Rock on schedule with whoever he had managed to bring. The man with the gun turned his head toward the sound. 1 second. Less. It was enough. Wade came around the crate, and the gun stopped being a factor. The room went quiet, except for labored breathing and the distant sound of horses moving off into the dark. Norah had the padlock open. She pulled the bar latch back, and pushed the interior door open, and the lamplight from the main room fell into the darkness beyond it, and Wade heard her breath catch a single sharp inhalation before she controlled it. He came to the doorway and looked. 3 women, young, all of them, sitting against the far wall with their knees drawn up, their faces turned toward the sudden light, with expressions that had the quality of people who have been in the dark long enough that light itself has become something they no longer fully trust. The youngest of them looked no more than 17.
She was in the center, pressed between the other 2, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that the knuckles were white. None of them made a sound.
Norah stepped into the room and lowered herself to a crouch so she was below their eye level rather than above it. Her voice, when she spoke, was the quietest and most carefully controlled thing Wade had heard all day. "You're safe. We're going to take you out of here. Can you stand?" The eldest of the 3 looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Then let's go. Right now." She helped the youngest to her feet first. The others rose around them. They came through the doorway into the lamplight, and Wade stepped back to give them space and kept his eyes on the room and the entrance and all the doors and the shadows behind the crates, because this was the moment when you were most likely to have missed something, when you were looking at what you had accomplished and not at what you hadn't accounted for yet. He had missed something. The voice came from the far end of the warehouse, from the darkness beyond the reach of the lamplight, from the direction of the entrance he had catalogued as a secondary exit and had not adequately considered as an entrance. "That's far enough." Calm, unhurried, the voice of a man who had given this instruction before and expected it to be obeyed. Wade turned. Sheriff Harlon Hail stood just inside the far entrance in the shadow at the edge of the lamplight with a revolver already leveled. His hat was pulled low against the lantern glare. His posture carried the absolute assurance of a man who had not been surprised by any of this. Not surprised. That was the thing that told Wade everything. He had not walked in to find them. He had been here, waiting. Behind Hale, just visible in the darkness of the doorway, was Silas Vane, his hand resting on the grip of his holstered weapon with the practiced readiness of someone waiting for a signal that had not yet been given. The 3 women went completely still. Norah turned and saw her father. Something moved across her face. Not the fear Wade might have expected. Something more complicated and more final. The grief of a person who has run out of reasons to hope that the thing they have been afraid to believe might still turn out not to be true. Hale's eyes moved to her. He held her gaze for a long moment. When he spoke to her, his voice was not different than it would have been at the dinner table. "I told you to leave it alone, Norah." She said nothing. "I told you there are things that are larger than what you understand, larger than what you were meant to understand." He paused. "I meant that kindly." "I know you did," she said, Her voice was very steady. That's the part I'll never be able to forgive. For a moment, something moved in Hale's expression. Not regret, something colder than regret, but structured the same way the shape of a thing that might have been regret in a different man. Then it was gone. His eyes moved to Wade. Something in them hardened into flat arithmetic. "Callum," he said, "you came out here to report wagon tracks." "That's right." "Should have stopped there." "Probably." "Now you're standing in my warehouse having assaulted my men with my daughter and 3 women who will be very difficult to produce in any legal proceeding." He let that sit. "You understand the position you're in." "I understand the position you're in," Wade said. Hale almost smiled. "Is that right?" "You built this on silence," Wade said. "On people who knew and stayed quiet. On men who had enough to lose that speaking was too costly." He paused. "But you're not behind closed doors anymore. You're at a river crossing with people who know exactly what you've been doing, and whatever happens here, the silence is already over." 6 people, Hale said. "In the middle of the night, with no witnesses and a long ride back to anywhere that matters." His voice was reasonable and patient, the voice of a man explaining something to someone who hasn't thought it through. "I've managed worse arithmetic than that." "Silas?" The name came from Wade's mouth, but it was directed past Hale toward the darkness of the doorway where Vane was standing. Vane's hand tightened on the grip of his weapon. "Your name is in the ledger," Wade said, not to Hale, directly to Vane. "Payments received, 11 entries going back to November, every single run." He paused. "Right now, you're an accessory. When this man kills a rancher and his daughter and 3 women in a warehouse, you're something else entirely. And there's no ledger entry that covers what comes after that." The darkness behind Hale was quiet. Hale turned his head slightly, a small motion, the smallest motion of a man who is very good at not showing what he's feeling. "Silas." Vane didn't move toward anyone, but he didn't move forward either. Something shifted in the composition of the room, subtle, the way pressure shifts before weather changes. Wade made his decision. He stepped forward, not rushing, not lunging. One deliberate step out of the cover he had been keeping near the crates into the open center of the warehouse floor, placing himself between Hale's gun and the women behind him. A clear target. No ambiguity about what he was doing or why. And then he raised his voice. Not to Hale. His voice came up into the register that carries across distance without effort, the voice you use when you need sound to move through walls and closed doors and compressed night air and reach the ears of people standing outside in the dark. "Judge Orville Mast," he said. $40 received, November 14th, 1888. Hale's finger tightened on the trigger. "Emmett Drury, First Territorial Bank, $60, November 14th, matching entry." "Stop," Hale said. "Reverend Francis Lowe, $20, same date." Wade kept going. He had read those pages twice in the gulch, and he had a rancher's memory for figures, and a former deputy's memory for the kind of details that matter in the moment you need them to matter. December 2nd, December 19th, January 8th. Callum. Hale's voice had changed, just slightly. The absolute assurance had acquired a fracture. February 3rd, February 21st, March 7th. The crossing at the lower ford. 4 women moved. Payment split 3 ways. April 14th. From outside the warehouse came a sound. Voices, not 1 or 2. Multiple. The sound of people arriving from different directions converging the sound of a group of people who have been moving through the dark and have just found what they were moving toward. Briggs. And the people of Red Rock County he had ridden to find. The main doors of the warehouse swung open. They came in out of the dark. Not a mob, not a posse with torches and noise, just people. Men who had worked this county their whole lives. A rancher's wife named Aldine Marsh, who had clearly ridden hard, and whose expression upon entering the warehouse communicated everything about what she intended to do with what she found there. Older men who had known Harlon Hail for 20 years, and were now looking at him with the specific expression of people who have just understood that a thing they trusted was never what they thought it was. Briggs was with them. He had a cut above his eye from somewhere in the last several hours, and his badge was slightly crooked on his chest. And he was breathing like a man who had ridden fast. But he was standing, and he was there. Behind him, visible now in the doorway, were more people still coming in from outside, drawn by the sound of Wade's voice, carrying through the warehouse walls. Hale looked at the people filling his doorway. The gun was still in his hand. His arm had not dropped, but the arithmetic had changed, and he knew it, and the knowing was visible in the way the absolute certainty went out of his posture, the way something fundamental shifted and diminished, leaving behind a man who was still standing, but was no longer standing on the same ground he had occupied 30 seconds before. Behind him, in the darkness of the far doorway, Silas Vane made a quiet decision. Wade heard the soft sound of boots on dirt retreating, and then nothing. Vane was gone into the night. That problem would not be solved tonight, but it had removed itself from this particular room, which was what mattered right now. Norah walked out from behind Wade. She still had the ledger pages. She had kept them in her hand through all of it, the way you keep something you know you are going to need. She walked to the center of the warehouse floor and stood in the lamplight, and she unfolded those pages and she began to read. Not for Wade, not for Briggs, not even for her father, for the people of Red Rock County who were standing in the doorway of a warehouse at a river crossing in the middle of the night, who had come because a deputy had ridden to find them and told them something that required them to see for themselves, who were now going to hear in plain spoken words the accounting of what had been done in their county under the protection of their trust. She read every name. She read every date. She read every number. Her voice was clear, and she did not rush, and she did not stop. And the silence of the people listening was the most complete silence Wade had heard all day. The silence of people receiving information that is rearranging everything they believed to be true about the place they lived in. Hale listened to his daughter read his ledger in front of his county. He listened to her read it all the way through to the end. Then his arm dropped. The gun hand fell to his side, not thrown down, not surrendered dramatically, simply lowered the way exhaustion lowers things, the way a man's arm lowers when the thing it was pointing at no longer exists in the form it had a moment ago. He stood with the revolver hanging from his fingers, and his daughter's voice filling the warehouse with the record of what he had done. And something in his face went through changes that Wade watched without intervening, because they were not his to intervene in. It was not remorse. Wade was honest enough with himself to say that. He had seen remorse, and this was not it. What it was instead was something colder and more final. The expression of a man watching the particular structure he had spent years building come apart, and understanding with the same clear-eyed calculation he had applied to everything, that there is no version of this in which the building stands. Briggs walked across the warehouse floor. He stopped in front of Hale. He looked at the man he had served under for 3 years. He looked at him for a long moment without speaking, and whatever passed between them in that silence belonged to them alone. Then he reached out and took the revolver from Hale's hand. Hale let it go. Briggs produced his handcuffs. Sheriff Harlon Hail of Red Rock County, New Mexico Territory, was placed under arrest not by a territorial marshal, not by a federal officer, but by the deputy he had tried to own through fear in front of the people he had tried to own through trust. Aldine Marsh was already moving toward the 3 women before the handcuffs were fully on. She did not ask for instruction, and she did not wait for it. She spoke to them quietly and moved them toward the door and outside into the night air, and the particular competence with which she did it told Wade that she had already understood from the moment she arrived what her role in this night was going to be. He watched it all from the edge of the lamplight where the dark began. His hands were steady. His breathing was normal. The work was done, or the first portion of it was done, and there was a long remainder ahead, because Silas Vane was out there in the night, moving fast on a horse, and Orville Mast, and Emmett Drury, and Francis Lowe were in their houses in Red Rock, not yet knowing that the document Harlon Hail had trusted himself to control had been read aloud at a river crossing before witnesses too numerous to silence. The machinery that Hale had built did not disassemble itself in a single night. Wade knew that with the same plainness with which he knew anything. The work of what came after would be slow and contested and would not go in a straight line. But the women from the locked room were outside in the night air, and the people of Red Rock County had heard the ledger read aloud, and Harlon Hail was in handcuffs, not because a rancher had been strong enough or fast enough or lucky enough, but because his own daughter had stood in the lamplight with the pages of his own record and read the truth out loud, where it could not be taken back. Wade stepped outside. The night air was warm and still and full of stars. He walked a short distance from the warehouse and stood at the edge of the light and let the noise and the activity settle into background and breathed. Briggs found him there after a while. The deputy stood beside him, not speaking immediately. He still had the cut above his eye, and his badge was still crooked, and he looked like a man who had run a very long distance very fast and had not yet fully arrived at the place where the running stopped. "The territorial marshal," Wade said. "You'll need to send for him tonight." "Already sent a rider," Briggs said, "before I came to the crossing from Red Rock." He paused. "I also left a written account with Aldine Marsh's husband, sealed, addressed to the territorial governor's office, in case anything happened to me tonight." Wade looked at him. Briggs met his gaze without flinching. "I've been doing nothing for 8 months," he said. "I didn't want to do nothing for 1 more hour." Wade said nothing for a moment. Then, "Your daughters, what's their names?" A pause. "Ellie and June." "Good names." Briggs looked out at the night. Something in his face that had been locked tight all day loosened a fraction. Not relief, not peace. Just the incremental giving way of something that had been held under enormous pressure for a very long time. "I'll still have to answer for what I didn't do," he said. "I know that." "Yes," Wade said, "you will." No comfort in it, but no cruelty either. Just the honest acknowledgement between two men of the way things were. Briggs nodded. He walked back toward the warehouse. Wade stayed where he was. He thought about Harlon Hail. He thought about the kind of man Hail had been or had appeared to be to an entire county for 20+ years. He thought about the specific and particular wrongness of a villain who does not believe himself to be one. The men who frightened him most in all his years of experience were not the ones who knew they were doing wrong. Those men were dangerous, but they were comprehensible. The ones who frightened him were the men who had built an explanation, a complete and internally consistent explanation for why the thing they were doing was not only acceptable, but necessary. Hale had been one of those men. I'd believed genuinely and without performance that his version of order served a purpose, that the squeamishness of ordinary people prevented them from understanding. That kind of man didn't produce remorse when the walls came down. He produced the cold calm of a man whose calculations had simply come out differently than expected. Wade could live with that. He could live with the fact that Harlon Hail would go to his accounting unrepentant, would stand before whatever judgment awaited him, carrying the full weight of his conviction that he had been doing what was necessary. That was between Hail and whatever came after. What Wade could not have lived with, what he had already not been able to live with for 20 years, was the knowledge that he had seen something wrong and found a reason to ride away from it. He reached into his coat pocket. His hand found the folding knife bone handle worn smooth from decades of use. He held it in his palm for a moment. He thought about the morning, the tracks in the dry grass, the ride toward a neighbor's fence line with a reasonable question and no knowledge of what he was riding toward. He thought about the rope on the floor of an empty building 20 years ago, and the choice he had made, and the 20 years he had spent inside that choice. He thought about Norah Hail, 24 years old and injured and exhausted, standing in the lamplight of a warehouse reading her father's ledger aloud to the people of the county he had governed. He thought about the girl who had been in that locked room for 5 days and was now standing outside in the August night air under a sky full of stars. He thought, it is not enough. It will never be entirely enough. The woman in the empty building 20 years ago did not get this night. She did not get Aldine Marsh, and she did not get the ledger read aloud, and she did not get to stand in the air afterward with the knowledge that the thing done to her had been seen and named. He thought, but these women do. These women get this night. He held on to that. Norah found him there at the edge of the dark. She had spent the last hour doing things that needed doing, practical and necessary things, speaking with the women from the room, speaking with Briggs, moving through the aftermath of the night with the same focused economy she had brought to every moment since he had cut the rope from her wrists that morning. She stood beside him, and they were both quiet for a moment, looking at the activity around the warehouse, the lantern light falling through the open doors, the people moving in and out. Briggs did the right thing tonight, she said. He did. Late. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then, my father genuinely believed he was maintaining something necessary, a version of order that required management that ordinary people were too weak-stomached to perform. She paused. He wasn't pretending. He believed it. That's the worst kind of wrong, Wade said. The kind that doesn't know itself. She looked at him. The dark eyes that had been red at the edges when he first saw them this morning were dry now and very clear. You knew something like this before, she said. I could tell when I told you in the gulch. He was quiet for a moment. 20 years ago, he said. Different county. I was a deputy. I saw the signs, and I talked myself out of them. Rode away. He paused. Woman was never found. The night settled around the weight of that. Did you know for certain, she said, at the time? He thought about the rope on the floor, the empty building, the question he had been answering in various forms for 20 years. I knew enough, he said. She nodded slowly, accepting that the way you accept a thing that is simply true and does not benefit from being argued with. Then she reached into the pocket of her torn blouse and produced his folding knife. She held it out to him on her open palm. He looked at it for a moment before he took it back. "I wouldn't be standing here if it weren't for you," she said. He turned the knife over in his hand. "Honest truth," he said. "When I saw you in that yard this morning, I almost found a reason to ride away. The thought was there, just for a moment. But you didn't." "No." He put the knife back in his coat pocket. "I didn't." She looked at him steadily. Then she said, "That's the whole of it, isn't it? Not whether you feel afraid, not whether it costs you something, just whether you stay or go when the moment comes." He looked out at the river crossing where the lamplight fell through the open doors of the warehouse and made a pale rectangle on the dark ground, and where the people of Red Rock County were doing the difficult and necessary work of understanding that the world they had been living in was not exactly the world they had thought they were living in, and beginning to figure out what to build in its place. "That's the whole of it," he said. They stood there together for a while in the warm August dark, and the Red River moved over its crossing with the sound that water makes when it has been moving over the same stone for longer than men have been around to hear it. And the stars continued their patient overhead work, and the night held everything it had gathered, the good and the terrible and the long overdue, in the same dark and without distinction. After a while, they walked back toward the light. There was still a long ride back to Red Rock. There were still accounts to be given to people who would need to hear them, and a territorial marshal to wait for, and a county to reckon with the full weight of what had been done in its name. The night was not finished, and the days ahead would not be easy, and the names in that ledger who are not yet in handcuffs would not become so without a fight. Wade Callum knew all of that. He walked back toward the light anyway, because the women from the locked room were outside in the night air, because Harlon Hail was in handcuffs, because a rancher who had spent 20 years carrying the weight of one wrong morning had on this particular morning in August of 1889 made a different choice, and he could live inside that. He could carry that. That was enough.